So, are we allowed to think aloud here?
Yes.
Yes, yes, you're allowed to think as loud as you can.
He's right.
It said that you met up with President Obama to discuss the state of Muslims in America. Man, I need to know, what did you guys talk about?
It was it was
Is it
interesting.
top
So,
secret? Can you not tell me?
no, it's not top secret at all. I wasn't in government, so it was not top secret. So basically, what happened was President Obama decided to. I think it was a program that the White House had. They wanted to identify 3 young Americans who were doing work in different fields. One in immigration, one in and this was after the recession of 2009 and 10, and who was doing work around building economic power within communities, and then also a person who was doing civic and political empowerment of communities. And so he essentially called 3 young Americans and had a series of discussions with them. And so the person that he called that does work on political and civic empowerment and national security issues that I was working on was me. And so he initially called me just to say, I'm following your work. I think you're doing really good work. And we had a conversation about, what we were doing at that point, empowering young Muslims and trying to build civic and political power for Muslims. And then we met up in the White House multiple times after that to discuss it as well, after the initial phone call. But it was great. It was, and the phone call was a surprise. So that itself was a really cool thing to do. I think, the one thing I appreciated about President Obama, of course, every government has its positives and negatives and pros and cons and all of that. And every administration and every president. The one thing I really did about President Obama was when you were having conversations about these issues, he didn't he listened, right? So when we were having some very difficult conversations because I don't know if you remember at that time, there was a series of attacks that were happening across the country. There was these ISIS-inspired attacks that were happening in Michigan and in Boston and in Orlando and in San Bernardino, California.
Is this around like the Boston Marathon incident?
Yeah, around that time.
Okay.
Boston Marathon, the underwear bomber that tried to blow him over on the plane in Michigan, and these incidents were happening. And so he was asking very sincere questions about, like, how do we get to the root, like, how do we address some of these difficult questions? How do we get the U.S. government is not the best messenger, of course it's not. So how do we engage people? How do I learn about this? What are the pathologies that go into this? And so what I appreciated about him was that he wanted to understand difficult issues. And he wasn't just making black and white decisions on things. There was things that we agreed with him. There was things that we disagreed with him on. But one thing I personally appreciated about him on most was that he really understand them. And he brought in experts and he didn't fan the flames as other politicians have done now, of hate and of bigotry. And I think that was something that I appreciated about him, whether you agreed or disagreed with his policies. And there was a lot of policies that we disagreed with and policies that we agreed with.
And did he ever ask you about why there is terrorism with Muslims, or was he ever interested in that kind of, like, what kind of questions?
He did. There was some of that. There was some of the questions which were about, he was, I mean, when he spoke to you personally, he would tell you, of course, like, this doesn't represent Islam. And he would say things like, we have had terrorism in this country since its inception. He was not naive to that. That was something that he understood, that this is not just unique to Muslims. There is a problem now because there are these groups, and I think groups like ISIS, and they're created for a reason. After we invaded, as the U.S. invaded Iraq, we created a power vacuum, and we created a condition for groups like ISIS to form. It didn't come out of the blue. There was reasons. When there's actions that are taken that are negative, it impacts the region as a whole. And so he understood that. He even had admitted that publicly. So he didn't ask you why are there Muslim terrorists. He would say, what can we do to address this issue? What can we do to get young people to know that this is not something that they should be attracted to? And our answers and my answers to him always were, that is not the job of the government. The job of the government is to try to have good policies and then engage people. Don't do more harm. Don't incorporate policies that drive people away, because one of the arguments of a lot of those extremists were that Muslims were treated as a fifth column, right? That they were not, they were mistreated, they were not accepted. And so our argument was, the more American Muslims can feel Muslim and American and engaged and accepted, that's how you address the issue, right? And look, that now that's not really, that is no longer an issue. What is the biggest threat to our country right now? It's domestic terror. It's white supremacist groups. It's neo-Nazi groups. It's not groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda. That was a wave. And I think what we tried to do was help them understand, what I tried to do was, this is ebb and flow. These are waves. These are geopolitical waves. This is not going to be ever. Don't make this civilizational war between Islam and the West. This is not true. These are people who are feeding this, who hate Muslims, and who are bigots, who are Islamophobic, who gain financially from this. Don't fall into that trap that these people want you to fall into. And most of them are wrong. Now look, what is the biggest incident now? The biggest incidents of terror and extremism are violent white supremacist groups and neo-Nazi groups.
And obviously, Obama is kind of not all politicians, but Obama's unique in his stance on Muslims like that. How did you see, like, what in your time in government? How did lawmakers and congressmen and all these kind of guys? Because I don't know if you saw this, but there was this one lawmaker. I think he was from Texas or Alabama or something, and it was all over social media, especially in the Muslim realm, where he said that you have to swear on the Bible. If you don't swear on that Bible, that you can't be a politician and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So these guys exist. Like, the guys that are like him exist, and they exist quite a bit. I mean, too much. Yeah. Like, even if there's just one of them, that's one too many. So what are the views of lawmakers and politicians today on Muslims, and how do they differ from before?
Yeah. So I always tell people, to answer a question about bigotry and Islamophobia in government, you have to understand the history of America and politics and government, just a little bit, to know that American politics has always included some bigotry and xenophobia and anti-immigrant racism and racism in general against Black. I mean, these are some foundational aspects of American politics, and we forget this because we're not taught it in school in many ways. We have to learn it.
And it's not as apparent now. It's not.
It's actually become much more apparent in the past 4 years.
Okay, yeah.
It wasn't apparent. It wasn't apparent before that to a certain extent, but American politics has always had what we call a xenophobic strain to it. Like, always, if you look at any community, immigrant community, they've gone through this with politicians. Of course, African Americans, they were. That story is a different story, because foundationally this country was built on oppression of Black people. But if you look at Japanese Americans, what happened after Pearl Harbor? What did the most progressive American politician was Roosevelt at that time. He was a progressive. He was someone who was, the New Deal, and he pressed progressive policies for people and helped people. He interned the Japanese. If you look at Jewish Americans and the type of bigotry and xenophobia against them in the 20th century, early 20th century, was intense. I mean, they had to open their own hospitals and schools, and because they couldn't go to regular schools. Historically, Black colleges, why were they formed? because people couldn't go to regular colleges like Harvard and why was Georgetown formed and these Catholic colleges? Because Catholics were being discriminated against. I mean, as recent as he was our first Catholic president, but that election cycle, it was full anti-Catholic bigotry. There was ads in newspaper against Kennedy that said, "Will you be loyal to the Constitution or the Pope?" And so this was a very normal part, and it has been normal part of American politics, using bigotry, xenophobia, racism to stir people up, to get people. Richard Nixon did it. It was called the Southern Strategy, right? It was to get people to as recent as the latest elections, we saw this whole conversation around suburbia and
Wait,
the suburbs will be destroyed.
what's the Southern Strategy? I've never heard of that.
So the Southern Strategy was essentially Nixon's campaign to convince people in the South who were leaning either Democratic or Republican, because the lines were still blurred at that time, especially in Southern states, to rise up and feel anxious about Black presence, about racism, about civil rights, and this whole notion that Black people are out to get you and to change your lifestyle, way of life, and criminals. And so it was literally to get the Southerners to vote Republican as an anti-Black vote.
I've never understood that. What is up? Why did politicians, or do politicians, especially like Nixon's administration, why did he hate Black people so much? I mean, or why did he at least want Americans to hate Black people so much to where he would literally have the CIA give Black people drugs?
Well, it's like I said, xenophobia runs deep in politics, right? So when there's hate, and you dehumanize the others, this is the problem with hate, and people don't understand about hate. When you are bigoted and you hate someone, you dehumanize them. When you dehumanize them and you think they're less than you, then your mind and your heart allows you to do things to them that you usually would not do. So, for instance, see Black people as subhuman, as not fully human, or as a race that is less than white people, then doing things like slavery, it can become justified, right? So slavery was justified by using Bible verses. It was justified by race dominance. When you do that to people, then you can do things to them that you usually would not do, right?
So
And that's what
yeah. So these people genuinely, like, personally dislike Black people and then try to find a way to get the country to think so too.
Some of them, yes, and some of them use it as political strategies to divide people and to get votes. So some of them, you actually have people or individuals or politicians who hate others. They might hate Mexicans. They might hate Muslims. They might hate Black people. Then you might have some who say, no, you know what? I have a Mexican son-in-law or a Black family member. I don't hate Black people. I don't hate Mexicans. I don't hate Muslims. I have Muslim friends. But you use it as a strategy to actually ensure that you win, or your goals are instituted, right? So for instance, you might actually have a Latino or Mexican son-in-law, but in place the harshest anti-immigrant policies, because what in your mind you're like, well, I'm not doing it to the good ones. I'm doing it to the illegals. I'm doing it to the criminal. I'm doing it to the rapists, right? Those are the language. That's language that we use to dehumanize people. So if I go to the border for my job a lot, and I see people who are at the border who are trying to get in, and the majority of them that I see are mothers and children and families who are trying to escape oppression and coming for a better life. But if you name them what? Rapists, murderers, drug dealers, gang. What happens? If I'm a normal American, just watch the news, time to do anything else other than work. I watch the news maybe an hour a day or whatever, or even less. That conversation, those words are going to convince me. And what I'm going to say is, oh, it's okay to maybe for a while put them in cages. At least the bad ones. We're not putting the good ones in cages. We're putting the bad one in cages. And so hate does that. And I think that's even for us as American Muslims, we have racism inside of our communities. You know that, right? We have major racism in our communities. We have sexism in us. We have xenophobia within our. We have all of this in our own communities, and we justify hating someone else because we dehumanize. And this is done in parts of our places where our families came from. In the Middle East, you see who kills Muslims the most. It's in South Asia and places like that, because we dehumanize each other. And so, but that's an old political trick in US politics. You dehumanize, you call people murderers, criminals, super predators, rapists. What happens? You allow people then to take advantage of them and do bad things to them.
So do politicians still in government? I know you don't know all of them, obviously,
Right.
but do they still like really dislike Muslims? Do they really still hate us, or has it calmed down a bit?
No. The intense fear of Muslims has calmed down since after 9/11. I think there's different categories of politicians they view Islam. I think some of them just don't know who Muslims are. Most of them don't have constituents who are Muslim. Most of them don't know any Muslims, right? So they listen to the media, they listen to Fox News, CNN, online media, whatever it may be. That's where they get the majority of their information. Once they start to have friends who are Muslims and donors who are Muslim and stuff like that, they kind of start to change their perspectives. There are some who hate Muslims, yes. So there are people who are in Congress, who used to be in Congress, who were just, people like this member of Congress from Texas, Louis Gohmert. He is one of those like anti-Muslim, like crazies in Congress that's been like that for years. And I remember when I was at MPAC and we made little profiles of these anti-Muslim bigots, and we would give them to people to be like, this is who they are. Like, they should be exposed. One of those congressmen, I'll give you an interesting example of how hate spreads, right? Was this guy named Allen West. He was a congressman from Florida. Now he lives in Texas now. He's the head of the Republican Party in Texas now. He was a big anti-Muslim bigot, huge anti-Muslim bigot. He was actually African-American. He was black. But anti-Muslim bigot, said a bunch of stuff about us, about Muslims, how Muslims were trying to like take over America and creeping Sharia and all this stuff. Recently, when the Supreme Court ruled against the suit, President Trump's suit to overturn the elections, he came out and said, the states who were on suit should secede from the union. So this is the type, like, when you have people that hate one group, that hate doesn't stop. It'll eventually spill over to hating everyone else. And this congressman is a good example of it. We used to warn people about him. People didn't take it seriously. He is now someone who is actually promoting states seceding from the union.
Isn't that a crime?
Hateful is people.
That's not a crime.
That I don't know whether that we have very liberal First Amendment issues. I think unless you take up arms or you actually physically try to do it, that's when it becomes a crime. But saying it is not a crime.